Hello, my name is Chris Loendorf, and I work for the Gila River Indian community. And I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about an analysis of obsidian we recently did from Pueblo Grande Museum. The site of Pueblo Grande is one of the larger sites on the lower Salt River in the Hohokam heartland of the Phoenix Basin in south central Arizona. It was a very large and important site during both the pre-classic and classic period. And I'm going to talk about an analysis that we did that included roughly 75 retouch tools in the collection that's accumulated from the site over the course of nearly the last 100 years. Almost all of these points, as is generally the case in this part of the world, are arrow points or arrow point preforms. Other types of tools such as scrapers or knives, bifacial knives are remarkably rare in the Phoenix Basin, and the vast majority of retouch tools are usually arrow points or preforms. We also determined source locations for 103 obsidian artifacts that have been collected through the site. And the collection includes materials that date from the Archaic period, roughly 5,000 years ago, up through the Historic period. And in this part of the world, the Akmalatam, who are the people who live in the Gila River Indian community, are continued to make and use projectile points up until the late 1800s. And so unlike other parts of the world, there's where metal points replace stone points, the stone continued to be used quite late. And as a consequence, we have information from sources in addition to just the archaeology, information from historical sources on regarding obsidian and other types of projectile points and their use. The obsidian is one of the most important materials for archaeologists to study trade and exchange, because it's possible to determine the location of where that material was derived from on the landscape with a great deal of precision. Essentially using EDXRF analysis, you can determine with what amounts to 100% certainty of exactly where that material was derived from on the landscape. Obsidian sources are also relatively localized. They occur in large deposits in very more point-like locations. Other materials, other types of raw materials tend to be more scattered across the landscape, whereas in contrast, obsidian is derived from more specific locations. And so when you find that on an archaeological site, you know exactly where that material was derived from through the use of EDXRF analysis. Gila River Indian community acquired a portable EDXRF over a decade ago. We've been using it to determine source locations for obsidian scents. And one of the other characteristics that also makes obsidian an ideal material for source analysis is that none of it is available locally within the Phoenix Basin. So all of this material has to have been transported from without. And there's also sources to the north, south, east, and west. And that allows you to sort of look at interactions with people who are living in all different directions from the community. One of the things that some people have simply taken for granted, and some people in the past have suggested that obsidian is the highest quality material that's available. But really quality depends on, in part what you're going to use it for. And most of the people who say that obsidian is the highest quality material are really only focusing on the flaking characteristics. It flakes very readily, and it also has very sharp edges, but that sharpness and that easy way in which it flakes come at the cost of durability. And one of the things that we did to sort of assess the difference in quality was to compare materials of different types. And what we looked at were materials with, basically that are very brittle versus materials that are much less brittle. So we compared the performance of obsidian, which is the most brittle material, and then chert, and then a type of siltstone, and then also a volcanic stone that we're calling basalt with a much higher impact strength. And so if you look at the materials that we tested, they vary by roughly a factor of 3, with obsidian being, in essence, about 3 times more brittle. The hardness is similar, and it's somewhat of a different concept to think of. And essentially, just like a glass, like a drinking glass or window glass that's very hard, it's also brittle. And so it shatters. And that's exactly what happens with obsidian when you're using it against more inelastic materials. And we tested starting with foam blocks, which are the most elastic, and then going to ballistics gel, and then on to rawhide, and finally ending up with bone. So we started out with more elastic materials, and we worked through to the least elastic materials. And what you find is that obsidian performs very well with elastic materials like skin, and it's important for cutting through the skin. But the problem is it's not durable. And if it hits something that's inelastic, like a piece of rawhide, it's actually worse than not having a point at all. And so obsidian actually hurts your performance under certain circumstances. So it's not so simple as obsidian being the highest quality material. And if you look at obsidian use over time, I think the archaeological evidence are consistent with that fact, that obsidian has its strengths and its weaknesses. And yeah, here's the primary weakness. You tend to end up with catastrophic failures, and that generally means that you are unable to rework the point. You can see that, and these are all, projectile arrows that hit bone at relatively low energies, relatively modest energies. And we had a hard time even collecting the fragments because they were shattering to such a considerable extent. And we're almost never able to rework the obsidian, whereas the other materials were more durable and could be reworked. Obsidian, again, has that downside of being very brittle and therefore, comparatively fragile. One of the other things that often isn't considered is what obsidian was used for, and that was to make weapons that were used in warfare. And the fact that obsidian was used to make weapons, I've argued, affected the people that you were willing to trade with. Whereas you might trade corn or something else more readily with other people, materials that could be used as dangerous weapons probably wouldn't be traded with people who were not your relatively close allies. And as I show you in the obsidian data, I think they support that conclusion, that obsidian was only traded amongst people who were closely allied with one another. So if you look at obsidian use over time, what you see is that it was almost not used. It's extremely uncommon for Middle Archaic at-level dark points and late Archaic at-level dark points. And again, essentially all of this, or nearly all this material, had to be brought into the Phoenix Basin from without. So it gives you a clearer picture of preferences in materials over time. And what you see is that the use of obsidian peaks in the classic period, and this is true elsewhere in the Southwest, just not in the Phoenix, in addition to the Phoenix Basin, but it's a pretty consistent trend that you see with obsidian peaking in the classic period, and still popular in the historic period, but not quite as popular. And somewhat unusually, basalt becomes very popular in the historic period after previously only being widely employed in the Middle Archaic. So that one's definitely a little bit different. And in terms of the collection that we analyzed from Pueblo Grande, about 40% of that was obsidian, but we also preferentially analyzed obsidian points because they're diagnostic, so that's probably overinflated a little bit. But the high incidence of obsidian at the site is consistent with its use during the classic period when obsidian was most popular. And you see a similar range of chert and chalcedony and a variety of other materials present as well, but the vast majority are obsidian or chert. The Pueblo Grande collection that we looked at had a total of just 8 different obsidian varieties. And although 4 of those sources, including Sauceda and Santanks and Topaz, are closer than Sauceda. Sauceda obsidian was the most common type present, and accounts for about 40% of the entire collection. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some sort of general patterns that you see throughout the Hohokam core area in the Phoenix Basin, in addition to just what you're seeing at Pueblo Grande here. 2 of the most common trends that you see are that superior obsidian use is much more common in the pre-classic period, and Sauceda obsidian use increases over time to that. And you know, sort of, I'll give away part of my conclusions now that Sauceda by the late historic period becomes the most predominant source that's employed. And so you have this general trend of materials from first east dropping out, and then material to the north dropping out, and material to the west dropping out. And then by the late historic period, you're pretty much down to Sauceda and Las Vidrios and Los Sitios del Agua, which are to the south towards the Gulf of California. So this shows the distance. The previous slide shows the probable least, or these are the routes of travel that would be the lowest energy, the most direct routes of travel between the source and Pueblo Grande itself. And if you look at the distance and then the percentage, again, you can see that there's a very weak relationship between the distance and of the source and then the proportion of the collection. And why that's important is because some people have argued that obsidian was predominantly obtained from people walking directly to the sources to get it. But if that were the case, then the closest sources should be the most common, and sites that are in relatively close proximity to each other should have roughly similar collections, because people will be walking in the same directions and sort of acquiring the same things. And what I'm going to show you in the coming slides is that's not the case. The closest sources are frequently, if not generally, not the most common, and oftentimes very distant sources, such as Government Mountain, which is over 230 kilometers away from Pueblo Grande, is pushing 10% of the collection. So you've got both distant sources that are much more expected, much more prevalent than you would expect based on their distance, and also close sources that are much less common than what you would expect based on their distance. And here's just an example that is particularly obvious with Gru and Casa Grande, both from the Coolidge area, both right next to each other, Gru being pre-classic and then Casa Grande being classic period. And what you see in particularly stark terms here is that huge drop off between Gru, which was over 96% superior obsidian, to Casa Grande, which is less than 10% superior obsidian. And the inverse is true for Sauceda. Only a tiny bit of Sauceda Gru, and it's the most common material in terms of obsidian at Casa Grande in the classic period. So you see this stark shift in patterns over time. And that pattern is pretty consistent across the entire Phoenix Basin, with something happening that caused the decline in obsidian, the superior obsidian, sometime during the Classic period. And here's another graph that simply shows that relationship between distance and proportion in the collection. And again, you see, sites that are located close to Sauceda with large amounts, but also like Gatlin, but also sites that are much more distant, like Marana, where it's the most common obsidian type. So these data, to me, indicate that people are predominantly acquiring this material through trade. And they're trading with external populations, and they tend to have the same trading partners over time. And so you tend to see the same sorts of patterns of utilization over time because they're interacting with the same people. Another thing that you do see is evidence for down the line exchange, or sort of moving from one community to another. And for example, here within along the Middle Gila, sources that are located to the east of the Middle Gila, such as Superior, fall off along the river from east to west, whereas sources that are located to the west of the Middle Gila fall off from west to east. And what that suggests to me is that people are coming from the outside and trading obsidian with people. People are coming from the Vulture source area, we're trading with folks on the western end of the community, and then some of that is moving down community member to community member along the Middle Gila. And again, so their obsidian is predominantly coming in through trade with external populations. And so that means that sites that are in the northern part of the Phoenix Basin tend to have more obsidian from the north, and sites that are in the southern part of the Phoenix Basin tend to have more obsidian from the south. And that's true throughout time. So in addition to these, sort of temporal patterns, you also have general spatial patterns. And if you compare Pueblo Grande Classic period to one of the large sites, GR522 or Lower Santan along the Middle Gila, you'll see that, again, regional variation between different parts of the Phoenix Basin, with, in particular, Lower Santan, which is located to the south of Pueblo Grande, has a lot more of the obsidian from Sauceda to the south. And the reverse is true for Government Mountain, where it's located to the north, and Pueblo Grande has more. And again, my suggestion is that that's from sort of trading with outside partners. But what you see in general, in terms of obsidian use over time, is that the strongest relationships in terms of, and the bottom part of the screen shows a cluster analysis of obsidian data from different sites in southern Arizona. And what you see is that sites that are located on the same rivers tend to have the most similar collections of obsidian, meaning that those people are interacting with others and amongst themselves more strongly than they are, with even other locations that are in relatively close proximity. So you tend to see similar use, stronger similarities between sites on the lower salt, and then also stronger similarities along sites along the Middle Gila. And even though often sites, the ones that are located close to the confluence of the two rivers are actually closer together with one another, but yet they share stronger similarities with sites as far away as Tunnel Basin. So sites like Pueblo Grande are actually, much closer to 522 or Lower Santan than they are to Tunnel Basin. But again, those similarities are stronger based on the rivers and the streams that they're located on, which makes sense, because one of the primary issues is what happens when you have water shortages. And people who are dependent upon canal irrigation, if people are diverting the water from upstream of you, as happened during the historic period here in the Phoenix Basin, people in the Coolidge area diverted water from the downstream users here within the Gila Riverine community, and it almost immediately caused conflict and starvation from the downstream users. So unless you have some sort of a mechanism to mitigate those conflicts, and you're going to either be, fighting with other people for your right to have access to that water, and the downstream folks are always at a disadvantage because the upstream folks always have the first crack at the water. And so either you have to just acquiesce to the upstream users, or you have to develop social institutions that allow the sharing, that control the sharing of that water, that avoid those conflicts to the extent possible. And so that's why I would argue that ties were closest along people who are located on the same streams. So now if you look at the overall picture of obsidian use through time, again, you see that trend of the general increase in Sauceda and then general decrease of Superior with, by the late historic period, the material is predominantly derived from sand tanks. And to flip ahead to the next slide here, the general pattern that you see is that materials that are in the territory of people who are allied with the Acme-Autumn here in the Phoenix Basin, such as the Tohono-Autumn, who are very closely related, share the same language, very closely interact with the Acme-Autumn. By the late historic period, those are pretty much the only folks that are allied with the Acme-Autumn. And the Peeposh, who are also closely allied with the Acme-Autumn, relocated in large part to the Grick in the early 1800s. And after they relocated, before they relocated, you do see materials to the west, such as Vulture. And in fact, in the middle of the historic period, there's Vulture is one of the most common materials. But then by the late historic, when the Peeposh relocated, that material drops out. And so this is true in general, that earlier in time, the materials like the San Francisco volcanics or Government Mountain were in the territory of people who were allied with the Autumn, the ancestors of the Hopi. And over time, those people got displaced from areas, such as by both the Navajo and the Apache, displaced former farmer populations from areas like the Superior Source. And so that became part of the Apache territory later in time. And I would argue that that was the basis for the drop off in Superior Obsidian. The Apache moved into the area basically and displaced the sedentary farming populations who had previously lived in there and who were closely allied with the ancestors of the Autumn in the Phoenix Basin. And very similarly, other materials, although this map doesn't show it very clearly, other materials such as sand tanks are actually in the territory of the San Papago or the Hiachid-Autumn, and those folks were not on good relations with the other Autumn groups for the most part. They were antagonistic towards other Autumn, and that material shows up rarely throughout the entire sequence. And so what you see in general is that obsidian use is really related with people who are more closely allied with the Atum and their ancestors, the Hohokam. And another trend that you see over time is evidence for an increase in conflict with, by the late historic period, projectile point data suggests that there was considerably more conflict that went on. And again, that's consistent with the expansion of these Apache and other Navajo populations and pushing people out of areas and a general intensification of warfare through time. So in conclusion, low impact strengths such as this, obsidian are not necessarily the highest quality materials, and they only have slightly better performance when performing elastic materials, but they're substantially less durable, which limits the potential uses of the material. Essentially, if you try to use it in a knife or something that's going to require heavy use or impacts, it's just not going to work. It's going to break apart on you. The use of obsidian to manufacture weapons for warfare appears to have affected who people were willing to exchange it with, and as a consequence, they only obsidian appears to have moved predominantly among more closely allied groups of people. Within the Phoenix Basin, obsidian appears to have been primarily acquired through exchange with outside groups. But then again, there's also evidence for down the line exchange amongst different people who lived within the Phoenix Basin. Regional variation in obsidian acquisition patterns suggests that prehistoric and historic populations in southern Arizona were not politically centralized or economically integrated. If they were, you would expect a lot more consistency amongst different areas. And instead, what we see is even sites that are in relatively close proximity have pretty different interaction patterns, and those actually intensify in the Classic period again, which is consistent with that evidence for increased conflict over time in the Southwest. And in final conclusion, one of the things that the obsidian data tells us is that patterns of obsidian acquisition that began in prehistory continue unbroken in the historic period. And this is part of the evidence that the Acmalatum are the direct descendants of the Hohokam who lived in the Phoenix Basin, because if they weren't, then they would have different patterns of interaction. If they simply moved in and replaced the Hohokam and the Hohokam somehow disappeared, they should have been having very different patterns of obsidian acquisition and who they're interacting with. And instead, what we find is that trends in where materials are coming from that started prehistory continue unbroken in history, which is again evidence for continuity in populations through time. And that's my presentation. Thank you.